the Palestinians on the internationally recognized borders, a proposal which incidentally was virtually identical to official, though not operative, U.S. government policy, the Rogers Plan. Israel refused it, and the United States backed them in that refusal. That led directly to the 1973 war, as was obvious at the time, and constantly reported to Henry Kissinger by oil company executives, ambassadors, and so on. After the 1973 war, the United States recognized that Egypt was not a basket case. It couldn't simply be dismissed. The United States therefore accepted Sadat's long-standing offers to become a U.S. client and moved to exclude Egypt from the conflict. That's the shuttle diplomacy and ultimately Camp David. The purpose and the obvious consequences were that with the Arab deterrent removed, Israel would be free to, that's the biggest Arab military force in the Arab world, Israel would be free to integrate the occupied territories and to attack its northern neighbor, with a huge increase in U.S. aid, reaching about 50% of total aid at that point. Predicted at the time exactly what happened, now acknowledged in retrospect as what happened, as of course it must. That's the one supposed contribution of the United States towards peace. In January 1976, the United States vetoed a Security Council resolution advanced by the Arab states and the PLO for a two-state political settlement. I won't go through the whole record, but that's continued up until today. What I said is precisely accurate. As for Israel's needing security, here again I urge you to take a look at the documentary record. One learns a lot from it, and you learn a lot from the fact that certain people don't want you to look at it. There's a very extensive documentary record of... There's a very extensive documentary record in Hebrew, if any of you have access to it, of Israeli government planning and thinking, cabinet meetings, etc., from 1967 through 1973. I've gone through it in detail. That's the period in which the rejectionist policy was established, peace was rejected, and so on. If you go through it, you'll find virtually no reference to security. That wasn't a concern. The reason is explained repeatedly by Israeli military leaders, General Harkabi, many others. The issue is not security. The issues that what you see discussed there are, for example, you see much more discussion of water, access to water, than you see to security. The point is that Israel does not want to abandon those territories ever, but it's not an issue of security. Israel is much more insecure trying to hold a hostile population inside it than it would be under a political settlement which would reduce tensions and leave a demilitarized Palestinian state on its borders contained within a hostile Israeli-Jordanian military alliance. Whatever the issue may be, it's not security, nor is it the PLO covenant. The PLO, in my view, should withdraw the covenant, but in 1977 it already announced that the covenant would have no consequences for interstate relations, any more than statements of the Zionist organization do. Israel was stated that the PLO in the covenant is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Yes, but they've said that it doesn't affect interstate relations. However, Israel is dedicated to the destruction of Palestinian nationalism, and it implements that dedication. Furthermore, quite apart from the actions, the official documents of the Zionist movement up until today still call for that. In fact, they even call, like for example, the governing Likud party has repeatedly, again a few weeks ago, announced that its claims to Jordan remain in place. It has not abandoned its claims to Jordan. David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, back at the time of partition, all the way back, in fact, repeatedly made it clear that there are no, as David Ben-Gurion put it, the bounds of Zionist aspirations cannot be controlled by any foreign element. They will be determined by what we do. As the 1949 war was continuing, he stated that we will not establish borders because we will determine the borders by our own actions.
Professor Chomsky, let me break in at that point.
Okay.
And there are a couple of things I'd like to pull out of Professor Chomsky's remarks and ask you, Mr. Perle. The first one that he formed as a kind of a question is, what should we expect with regards to Nicaragua when, as we did in 1985, engage in a blockade, and in effect engage in aggressive actions against Nicaragua? Did we not push them into looking to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for assistance?
Well, I believe that Nicaragua was already not only looking to the Soviet Union for assistance, but receiving it. and receiving it on a sizable scale, using equipment received from the Soviet Union and from Cuba in El Salvador in order to try to produce a change of government in El Salvador. We started out, the Carter administration started out. Some of us were a little dubious about that policy, but nevertheless it started out well disposed toward the new Sandinista administration. I think that's undeniable. Its attitude toward the Sandinistas began to change when it became evident that the Sandinistas were not putting in place the sort of democratic administration that one had expected, and indeed that a number of the Contra leaders, for that reason, ultimately left the Sandinista leadership and decided, and this must have been a bitter disappointment, that they would again have to take up arms in order to attempt to realize their ambitions for the democratization of Nicaragua. And what we have in Nicaragua today is a police state. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't see any likelihood that it's going to change. But what I found most peculiar about Professor Chomsky's view, and perhaps he'd care to say more about it, is why he believes it is in the interest of the United States to drive Nicaragua into the arms of the Soviet Union, since he believes that that's what we did. As one listens to Professor Chomsky, I think one can only come to the conclusion that the United States is led and has been led for the last 40 years by people who haven't the slightest idea of how to promote their own intelligent interests.
Oh, no.
Because as he describes both our policies which he derives from documents, and I can only repeat that unless I'm mistaken, you've never served in government, because anyone who would attempt to derive the conclusions you do from the kinds of documents you've been reading simply doesn't understand what it means to formulate policy in a real government.
Well, your question was...
If you accept the general thrust of Professor Chomsky's view, then I think you have to come to the conclusion that the leadership of the United States for the last 40 years has acted contrary to the interests that he says they had established as their principal interest. That was the prosperity of the United States in a world of liberal internationalism. I happen to think liberal internationalism is a pretty good thing, and Professor Chomsky obviously doesn't. I believe it is conducive to the prosperity of the United States and to the prosperity of the world, broadly speaking. Professor Chomsky is troubled by the fact that Honduras exports snow peas. He's mentioned it twice. I presume they export snow peas because there's a market abroad for snow peas, and it seems to me, on the whole, a good thing for countries that are able to produce and export and earn income thereby to do so. The fact that there is poverty in Honduras is not an argument against building up Honduran export industries. I don't know what that bell is meant to signify.
Maybe that's time for me to...
Well, it is true that the Palestinians have made it a part of their covenant that Israel has no legitimate right to exist as a Jewish state in Palestine, and if it were up to him, he would change that, and while they haven't changed it, they've sort of disavowed it, and so we mustn't take it too seriously. I do think that misses the point. There is a reason why the PLO has not revised its covenant to change that provision, and the reason is that it would tear the PLO apart if they attempted to do so, because a significant element within the Palestine Liberation Organization is dedicated to the destruction of a Jewish state in Palestine. I don't know where Professor Chomsky stands on the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. I happen to believe that it is right and proper that there should be a Jewish state in Palestine. I am not, as a consequence of that, unsympathetic to the situation of the Palestinians, but a solution, when one is found, has to be one that guarantees some reasonable security for the Israelis after what the Israelis have been through. And as you look at the turbulence in the Middle East, it seems to me understandable that any Israeli government would want to move with extreme caution in concluding agreements that entail a significant sacrifice in terms of physical security, that is, by giving up territory that acts as a buffer in exchange for promises originating with an organization that remains dedicated to Israel's destruction.
Professor Chomsky, did you wish to
Well, I was
respond?
asked, several questions came up. Let me deal with them one at a time. Why is it in the interest of the United States to drive Nicaragua into the hands of the Soviet Union? That's transparent, actually. First, let's establish again that that was the policy of the United States. Simply to review the record, the Carter administration tried very hard to, first of all, supported Somoza until virtually the end, long after the Nicaraguan business community, our natural allies, turned against him, and after our other Central American allies turned against him. When it became impossible to support Somoza, because he was obviously gone, the Carter administration tried to maintain the National Guard in power. In fact, it called upon the Organization of American States to intervene to maintain the National Guard in power in a policy that Latin Americans called Somocismo without Somoza. That failed. The Latin American countries refused to go along. After that, the Carter administration tried in every way to rescue the National Guard. So, for example, they sent American planes under Red Cross marking, it's a violation of the laws of war, incidentally, into Managua to take National Guard officers out. The Contras were reconstituted on the border. They were quickly picked up by the Reagan administration and turned into a terrorist force to attack Nicaragua. Meanwhile, the Carter administration offered aid, but not to the Sandinista government. Let me repeat that. That aid went to the private sector. It was, again, a last-ditch effort to try to prevent the Sandinistas from coming into power. Now, maybe the Carter administration would have made some arrangement. We can't tell. But when the Reagan administration came in, that was finished. They launched an attack against Nicaragua almost immediately, both a military attack and an economic attack. They prevented our allies from sending aid to Nicaragua. So, for example, there was pressure put on France to stop them from providing arms. The story about arms in El Salvador, I'll go into it if you like, but there's nothing to it. Both economic warfare and military warfare increased international. Both economic warfare and military warfare increased. International lending institutions were pressured to stop giving aid. An embargo was called at a time when Nicaraguan trade with the entire Soviet bloc was roughly comparable to ours. Again, I say it does not take a genius to figure out that the result of these policies will be to force them to rely on the only group we allow them to rely on to defend themselves against our attack. So assuming something short of total stupidity, that was the purpose, since it was obviously the perfectly predictable consequence, and the consequence that to a limited extent took place.
But
that's now why I didn't quite answer yet why we wanted to do it. Well, the answer to that's obvious. In fact, it's a consistent pattern. We did it when we wanted to overthrow Guatemalan democracy. We did it when we wanted to overthrow Dominican democracy in 1965. If you want to attack and destroy a political system, there's a way to do it within our political culture. Try to show that it's an agency of the Soviet Union. Once you've succeeded in establishing that, then you can attack and destroy it. This is a record that has been replayed so many times since 1947, when Dean Acheson pioneered it with a totally fabricated account, as he more or less conceded, of the Soviet intervention, which didn't exist in Greece at the time of the Truman Doctrine. As he knew and as we now know, the Soviet intervention was an attempt to try to get the Greek guerrillas to stop interfering with an imperial settlement that they had made with Britain, which granted Britain control over Greece. That's not even debatable anymore. That record's been replayed over and over. The Soviet Union, incidentally, does exactly the same thing when they want to invade Hungary or Czechoslovakia or whatever. They argue that they're defending it from CIA machinations, and they try to show that they're working for the CIA, etc. Other powers do the same thing. It's an obvious way we should do it. Now, was U.S. policy as inept as Mr. Perle suggests? On the contrary, it was extremely successful. The policy of liberal internationalism reconstituted Europe and Japan on the old order, on the old conservative order. Remember what that meant. That meant eliminating, often destroying by violence, the anti-fascist resistance in much of the world. It meant destroying labor unity. It meant blocking efforts at radical democracy that had substantial support in both Europe and Japan.